welcome to All the Grief, a weekly podcast for all those who have been touched by grief. We are your hosts. I am Rebecca Luttrell.
And I'm Andrea Giron-Mathern.
We are two friends, a therapist and a social scientist, both highly sensitive fellow grievers, here to share our hearts as we talk about all the grief.
So today we're going to talk about our society and how we really have been reflecting on how we are in a grief-bereft society. Before we kick it off, how are you, Rebecca?
Hey, Andrea. I'm doing well. I feel like we need to also just name that there's construction happening in the background.
I'm so sorry, everyone.
Because that's going to be part of this podcast. And it just is what it is. We're in the present moment. This is life. Things happen.
And construction never happens when it's supposed to,
No.
Which is my lesson for the week.
Totally. I'm doing well. I've had, just a sweet week of time with my girl, and it's summer. It's a little weird. I do feel like the weather's kind of weird, and it doesn't feel like June at all. Doesn't feel like Colorado ever. So I'm sure you're sharing in that. So I think I'm feeling just a little bit of climate grief, which I think we'll talk about more explicitly on another episode. But it's like my nervous system doesn't like it. The world feels weird right now.
Totally.
Yeah. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm having just a hard week. I think my siblings and I are really dealing with, even though it's 3 years after my dad passing, are really dealing with supporting my mom as a sort of single woman navigating the world, the levels of responsibility that we have to take on, and sort of reflecting on both how she deals with grief. And I sort of took a pause to say deals, because I don't know that she has had a plan for dealing with grief, and how that's manifesting, in some really physical and emotional ways, and just trying to figure out how to support her and support ourselves and support one another. And it's just, moving through a brand new family dynamic. It's been hard. It's been a hard week. So yeah, I'm happy to see your face.
Thank you. Thank you for presencing us on what's happening. Yeah, it's another topic, right? A whole thing on aging parents, with your mom losing a love who's also your dad, and that whole dynamic feels like so rich.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and that flipping that dynamic of the parent-child relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you, as a therapist, have probably had to deal with that, where suddenly your mom needs you and she never needed you in that way before. And both you want to be there, and she's I'm sure it feels vulnerable and weak, and, all these things. And so, yeah, it's complicated.
It's so complicated. Life is complicated. So yeah, our topic today is our grief bereft culture, our grief denying culture, our grief avoidant culture. I mean, it's, I feel like we kind of have spoken a little about this before, but that before grief, we're sort of in the trance of the culture. And I know myself, I know what grief avoidance feels like. I know in my bones what it felt like to want to be helpful, to not know how to be helpful, to just be like, maybe I won't talk about it and that'll help you. And whatever that was. And then when you cross the threshold into your first grief, you see how awful it is that we don't know how to be with grief, because it is an experience, like you say in our intro, like all the humans have grief. And then I even had grief I might not have known of until I felt into my, a death grief. And then it was like, oh, there's so much grief, that's behind all of that. And so I'm going to lead us off with just a couple of quotes. One from Francis Weller's The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And he's talking about why he wrote the book. And he wrote the book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, for a number of reasons, most notably to restore soul to grief work and grief to soul work. I feel grief has been colonialized by the clinical world, taken hostage by diagnosis and pharmaceutical regimes. For the most part, grief is not a problem to be solved, not a condition to be medicated, but a deep encounter with an essential experience in being human. Bringing grief and death out of the shadow is our spiritual responsibility and sacred duty. And this is the heart of so much of why I feel called to talk about grief. And then there's a little piece that Martin Prechtel, in his book, The Smell of Rain on Dust, he talks a lot about the culture and is really down on our culture. but he talks about the way that we might even suppress our own grief because of the grief averse culture. And I think knowing we're not going to be met in our grief. So I'll just read the whole thing because I don't remember exactly where he starts to say it, but I feel like you need the context. Like smooth, water-polished pebbles, wet like jewels in a bracelet at the bottom of the river of the collective human soul, there are noble and profound human beings whose radiance and value are unknown even to their closest neighbors. People whose depth and nobility of soul live unexpressed inside situations that are for them so unnatural, oppressive, and beyond their control that as individuals they intentionally obscure their own spiritual majesty with a theatrical veneer of the same banal drivel that surrounds them every day to avoid the pain of being mocked or trivialized if discovered by the heartless and uncomprehending. By doing this, they inadvertently subsidize the mentality that oppresses them, adding further still to their own false belief that they are alone and that there are no others like them. It takes courage to be what the world needs, but the world never seems to change when you are alone. What do those quotes evoke in you?
I think like a new, we talked about this a little bit last week. Like it's like you see the world one way and then something happens and you see the world the other way and you wonder, it's this mystery of why did all these people talk to me now? Why didn't they talk to me before? It's like the other experience I had of it, and I cannot remember. I'm sure we have talked about it, was childbirth. We're both mothers and I had severe preeclampsia and had to give birth to my babies very early. And afterwards, several of my friends who I'm very close with talked to me about how they had emergency deliveries to save their lives and the lives of their babies. And I thought, why don't we talk about this? It's like you have to cross this threshold and then you can talk about it. And on one side, it's like we want to avoid the fear, right? Like we want to avoid the fear of, if I tell you giving birth is scary or that problems can occur, then that's what you'll be worried about. So I don't want you to worry. And on the other hand, I was so naive. An Olympic athlete who just passed away yesterday or the day before, she was found dead as a result of preeclampsia.
Oh, wow.
And and I didn't know you could die from it. I was, and so, the nurses are saying like, if you have this symptom, you need to tell us. And I'm like, well, I don't want to tell you that I'm having that because you seem very alarmed. But had I known just how serious it was, I would have been more forthcoming. And so, I think those quotes and kind of thinking about this idea of how we avoid death, yet it's the one thing we all share, right? Like we're going to experience it one way or another. Mm-hmm. Probably multiple times throughout, most likely multiple times throughout our lives. And so bridging that gap between before it's happened and after it's happened seems to me, I think, why I'm doing this podcast with you, because it's like then when people are on the other side, are in the grief, those of us who have built that wall or haven't crossed the bridge have no idea what to do. And it's all this fear. I'm afraid I'm going to make you feel worse. I'm afraid you're going to make me feel worse.
Right. It's contagious. As you're sharing it, I also feel aware that most likely the people who are choosing to listen to us have experienced grief. And it's really hard to get people who haven't to be willing to have the conversation about grief. Like you have to have a certain curiosity, a certain awareness to want to talk about it because we don't see it in our culture. And I think actually the childbirth thing is such a great parallel because I know when I was taking like the birthing classes and we would talk about how once we started to medicalize birth, nobody sees birth anymore. So you actually don't even know what's normal in birth.
Yes.
So if you had grown up and you were a child in the room while your mother was giving birth, or like you were with your aunt or like your neighbor and you were someone who was assisting and you just watched this thing happen and you knew, oh, when that happens, it's bad. Oh, when that happens, it's good. And you had the full story of birth. So I think because we haven't witnessed it, we don't have all the things that are natural in our nervous system. And then people become really protective of like not telling you all the terrible stories because you don't want that in your nervous system and to feel fearful. But we've kind of that's been robbed from us in this way of just knowing birth and knowing in your bones. And it's the same thing with grief. When you live in a culture that's not grief averse, everyone grieves together. There are ways you symbolize that you're in mourning for a year and everyone knows that, every stranger on the street, and they respect it and they're not afraid of you. They lean into you.
Right.
It's not like we're just hypothesizing. It actually happens in other cultures that accept grief and people are around it and death is a part of life and you're talking about it. It happens and you know it's going to happen. And it doesn't make the grief easier. It just makes the support there
Right.
inherently. And you know, people have my back
Yeah.
and there's a moment where they're going to be grieving and they're going to know I have their back. And it's like this dance of life. And we are in a culture that is death denying on so many levels. We relate to it like, oh, death is a tragedy instead of, I mean, we're not meant to live forever on this planet. We are going to die. And so sometimes
Right.
even a natural death at a really old age feels like a tragedy because we just, we don't want to believe that there's an end.
Right. And I love what you were saying about the birth and how it's become so medicalized or hospitalized, because I was reading this article by a hospice doctor, hospice care physician, and she was talking about in the 1800s, it was super common to do post-mortem photography. So just after someone died, to take a picture of them, and then the family would display that picture in their home as a reminder of the loss. And that, I think we all know this, death was something that happened in the home.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't happen in a hospital bed. You know, you were surrounded by your family. And so in those last days, or, whether they were in those last days because you were 24, and those last days because you were 74. Grandkids would be there or cousins would be there. And then they would come in the couple of days following the death and see the body continuing that sort of like that parallel with giving birth and death, like only continues. So our culture did have those practices. But as we've become more nuclearized, right? Like, this is my nuclear family. This is our home. I'm far away from my family and friends. And as medicine has progressed, it's also kind of moved us away from the humanity part of it, right? Which is seeing the suffering and witnessing, bearing witness to all of it. Like, giving birth is suffering and there's some grief, like my baby was in me and now my baby's out of me. And
Yes.
there's joy. Like, there's so many things. And the only people that are bearing witness to that are you and your partner, hopefully.
Right. Which is only recent history of medical history, right?
Totally. And a room full of strangers, versus, I don't know, other ways that could happen. Not that it's always happened that way before. It was, before, even when they were doing midwifery and giving birth and husbands were not allowed. But still, I feel like some ways we've kind of moved away from the humanity of these experiences, and the witnessing of these passages is what they are.
Right. And the soul, like whenever I talk about soul, it's like maybe you have a belief that soul before you were born, that's going to continue after you were born. And for some people, just a soul of a certain higher self or witness self on this planet where you just can have your mouth dropped in awe that we even exist, that there are trees that know how to go through seasons and die and come back. And like, that you can just have a certain awe of like nature and science. And all of that for me is soul. And it's like we sort of suck the meaning out of our lives with having an aversion to actually being with a human experience that's just so human. And I think that's important. Like, how do we start to get that back for ourselves? My hope is a podcast like this, we're offering something that starts to like stir those conversations up for people that are really saying, how do we start to bring people back to a reverence for the experience of being human, which include, it's interesting that we're talking about birth and death, right? The beginning and the end. We're like, no, thanks. We want all middle. It's like, we don't want to know in the beginning, go do that in a room privately somewhere. We don't want to see it. We don't want to be a part of it. And then like, could be bad and I'm scared. And then at the end, it's like, go do that privately in a room somewhere. I'm scared. I don't, like we just, the richness of life. And I think that's always the bittersweet part of a grief journey, is like in the depths of pain that you also touch something so precious and profound, which is that we're mortal, that the people we love, we will lose. It's like this weird experience of awakening and in pain. So I think we've also said, like, I don't wish it on anyone. I mean, I wish I could keep you from experiencing death, from the pain of it, but it also is just so essential for remembering, I think, who we are. That can be part of your experience. I know it's not for everyone and for every experience, but it can be this just reminder. I mean, when my sister's first child was alive in utero, and then there was a point where he wasn't, and they didn't know that until they started to deliver. But I remember going into the room to hold him after he was stillborn. So I'm going to hold his lifeless body. And there was something, it's an experience I'll never forget. It's really hard to describe because there was just this like sense of a sleeping baby. But I just remember in that moment thinking life has never been shorter. You know,
Mm.
it's just like life is really short, and it had never been shorter than in that moment that we were sort of welcoming him in and saying goodbye at the same time.
Ah, yeah. Sorry, I'm at a loss for words. That was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I know when I hear things like that, and I think this is exactly what we're talking about. I feel so much tenderness and love and empathy and care for you and your sister's partner, and all the family members and people touched by that birth and death. And I feel incredibly grateful that my little boys, I got to hold them and, they smile and I think that's the combination, right? There is this deep sadness and it is mixed with so many things. And I think we have this tendency to want to label, particularly feelings, like good feelings and bad feelings, right? So feeling what I should be feeling right now is like just sadness. And I feel so much of that. And I feel like moms everywhere who got to birth live babies should hold them a little bit closer. Like that isn't a guarantee, not because I'm glad it was you and not me, not any of that, but because it's a realization that life is not a guarantee, that the
Right.
first breath is not guaranteed. And so I think that's the piece of it, that fear part that really keeps us from being open to seeing grief, to witnessing grief, to demonstrating grief in front of people. My husband and I were walking the dog and we were talking. And so I think I mentioned this on the last podcast, but because of COVID, we couldn't have a real funeral for my father. I was raised Catholic. He was very devout Catholic. So that was really troubling for my family. And so a year later, a year after his death, a good priest friend of his held a Catholic mass. And since we had not buried his body, we had him cremated. We were able to do that. So people who know about Catholicism, had we interred him somewhere and didn't have a body, we couldn't have a Catholic funeral. So luckily we could. And I really didn't want to do it. It felt so disjointed from the acute pain
Mm-hmm.
of when you normally have a funeral ceremony and are with your family. But of course, I was a lone voice and other people in my family needed it. And so we did it and I was there. And I cried like he had died yesterday, I'm sure, to other people. And my husband said the other day, he said, your uncles kept asking me if you were okay, like that there was something wrong with you, because I was so openly mourning. And I just think about that. I think about the expectation of that would have been totally okay at a funeral 8 days, 10 days after he passed. But a year after he passed, like I should not be crying like that in public. And I laughed at my husband. I was like, God, if they really would have known what was happening in my head, if I would have acted out on what I really wanted to do, which was scream at the priest to shut up and flip over this table of ridiculous objects people had put up in the front of the church and just tell people to get out.
Yeah,
That's what I really wanted to do.
exactly.
Maybe I would have said, okay, Nate, maybe I need some professional help. Just crying?
Right. There's so much that I can express about that. I remember like my cousin's wife, I believe her mom died. So she had just died and we were all getting together and I was just like, hey, like I heard about your mom and she was medicated. They had put her on medication. And she said, yeah, I'm fine. I'm just taking medication, because I was just too sad or something. And I remember and this was before my dad died and I had felt grief, but I remembered thinking that doesn't feel right. And it's just like that quote in the beginning about needing to be medicated. And in Martin Prechtel's book, he has a guy who I want to say might have been Catholic as well. But he was really aware of Martin Prechtel's work around like ritual and grief. And he said, look, my mom died. What are some things I might be able to bring into the funeral to do for her? And he starts giving him all these, he's like, yeah, no, they're not going to go for that. No, right. It's like, they're good Catholics. We're not doing any of those. That sounds crazy. And so he found a way to do some private ritual that was really special and sort of close to what Martin Prechtel was recommending. And then for the funeral, he just had a commitment to weep authentically. It was like, I'm going to cry authentically. And then he's giving the eulogy. He's crying so hard. And he sees these ambulance pull up and he's like, oh, that's what's going on. That's weird. Who are they for? They were for him.
Oh
People
my
were worried about
gosh.
him. And he said, I'll tell you what expressing your grief gets you in Western culture. It gets you a ride in an ambulance. Like that they thought he needed to be committed. He wasn't okay. Like it matches what you're saying, right? And that,
100%. I'm sure
yes,
my uncles thought I should be on antidepressants. I'm
yeah.
positive.
Yes. And I would actually argue that suppressing grief is what creates depression, because then sadness unexpressed becomes flat, and
Mm,
we don't want to feel anything in the world
mm.
because it's not safe to feel our sadness. And that flatness starts to dull our light. It's that when we can go and feel the bigness of grief, we can feel the bigness of joy. We're meant to feel our emotions. But when we're saying there's something I can't feel, we start tamping down all of the emotion. And so it just feels so sad to me every time I encounter one of these stories. I mean, my ex-husband's dad, he died when my ex-husband was 13. He said my dad's last words to me were, "Don't cry."
Mm.
So he just thought that's what he was supposed to do. And it's like, here's your dad who's leaving you and saying, "Don't cry." And you want to honor him. I mean, of course you would cry. You were still a child and you
Right.
just lost your dad who you loved so much. That grief just gets, yeah. And the good news is you can express it at any time. So if you've been suppressing a lot of grief, find your way to a safe place like a therapist or a grief group or whatever, because our bodies live in the present. So if the grief's there, it's still there, and that dam can be released. I have had clients, I say it's going to be weird because you're not used to grieving and you're going to hate me because there's a big dam that you've been holding. So a lot's going to come out at once, and you're going to be confident it's not going to stop. And it will, because our emotions just want to be felt. But I can't promise you a timeline, but just keep feeling, keep feeling, keep feeling. And exactly that happens. They come in, they're like, "I hate you.
Oh.
I know. And I love you, and I love your grief, and I see you." And they're there and they're feeling it. But then there's a point where they're like, "God, I feel so light now. And I've just been walking around with so much heaviness." And yeah, it came up at weird times. I was like in the mall and I started crying, and I had to run into like a store that no one goes in and hide in the corner and just cry, but that it was worth it because now they felt alive again in a way that they just like hadn't when they were trying so hard to not be sad.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So many things resonated in that. Obviously, like my uncles, who I love and would protect me to their death. And also, I'm sure we're probably like, Bryce, go get her on some meds. But a couple of things, like, even though I felt pretty comfortable, like I said last time, like I just kind of decided my grief was just pouring out of me. I would have had to go out of my way to a pretty sneaky degree to hide my grief from my husband or my children or my mom or anybody. And so I just decided I don't even have the energy at this point in my grief to do that. So everybody's just going to have to see it and deal with it. I just
Mhm.
didn't care about anybody, which was great because I just cried wherever I needed to.
Good.
But then there comes a point where, like, that's totally okay for however long. And then there comes a point where it is inappropriate for Andrea just to cry in a meeting or whatever it is, out at dinner. And so when you were saying that, I remember I would get on my bike and all of a sudden I would just fucking cry. And I would be on my bike just like bawling. And it could
Mm.
be a song, or all of a sudden emotion would I could just feel it like rising in my body, and it would just come out. And I started to look forward to that part of my workout. Like I was like, oh, if I need to process some shit, it's going to come out on my bike. This is going to be great. Because I did feel good after. Even though I was really sad, there would be this moment where I would just laugh and think, thank God I do this in my basement, because I am like standing up on a stationary bike, sweating and bawling my eyes out. And so I would have those
Mm.
just gates open. And I noticed that those happened when I had started to try to rein myself in for other people's comfort.
Hmm. First of all, I love that you initially did not give a fuck about other people's comfort. Amen, amen, amen. So it feels like such a gift as a woman in our culture that you
Mhm.
could do that, because I think we're meant to be expressive, and all of the beauty of pieces in our
Mhm.
lives that say feel, feel, feel. We have this
Yeah.
directive to feel, and then we have a culture saying don't feel, don't feel, don't feel. And so there's
Yes.
this suppression that happens, and we worry and like, am I doing it right? So I love that you were like, I'm doing it right because I'm fucking sad and I'm crying. But then that there's this timeline that starts to happen, and then that voice eventually starts to have power, which I still think it shouldn't. And I actually said in a group before where someone was like, and you can't cry at a board meeting. And I'm like, well, I actually want to live in a world where you can cry at a board meeting.
Mm.
That's who I am.
Mhm.
So that, and I think the movement piece is so important. I mean, it's stored in our cells. And so it makes sense to me that starting to move and to move in a way that makes you sweat. Like it starts to move emotion.
Mm.
And because you were willing and saying yes to this is what's here, you could have that huge release and that feeling of feeling so good on the other side of it. And I'm going to misquote it, but the essence of it is there. Essentially, Megan Devine in her book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, says, I don't care if it happened 8 days ago or 80 years ago, it just happened.
Mm.
And I think that that's the piece to keep remembering in a culture that's like, yeah, but that was a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
Someone commented on one of my social media posts, and I could hear like the genuine care and concern for their friend who was in grief. And they said, but what do you do when someone's just stuck in profound grief and it's been a few months? They're not doing well. And I was like, oh, it's only been a few months. That first year is fucking brutal.
Yeah,
So this person loves their person and they want them to be
of
okay.
course.
But they're thinking, and we're all wanting to fix it, so I'm just imagining this rallying of cheerleaders around this person who's in deep grief, but you end up misattuned. So it's not mean spirited, but I know every single grief I've ever encountered just wants you to say, of course you feel that way. Of course you're still that sad.
Mm.
I don't care how long ago it was.
Mm.
And so people will try to talk themselves out of it. And I say,
Mm.
of course you're still sad. What do you mean you shouldn't
Mm-hmm.
be sad? Of course you're still sad. It's heartbreaking and it's never going to stop being heartbreaking.
Mm.
And we just need to hear that. You don't need to do anything special. The heart just needs to feel witnessed.
Right.
Just tell me it makes sense. You can say, I hate seeing you suffer.
Yeah.
And of course you're suffering. It's so sad.
Yeah. Yeah. I do remember one of my uncles hugged me early on, and he just hugged me and he said, this will never be okay.
Mm.
And it felt so good because I was like, you're right.
Right.
Like nothing, no time, no explanation, nothing. This will never be okay. It still happened. But yeah, so something like that, or other friends who had parents who died and just told me, like, it just sucks. I wish I could tell you anything else, but this just sucks. So yeah, I agree. And the other thing that it reminded me of and bring us back to the grief avoidance was I found this research article about the grieving killjoy. And the author talks about, so I'm not sure if people are familiar with the idea of the feminist killjoy, but it's basically the idea that in Western culture, we hold aloft these ideas of happiness, of future orientedness. Everything is forward looking. And so grief in its slowness, in its reflection, like you're constantly looking to the past because that's all you have now. And in its sadness and emptiness and loneliness and all these things is like the opposite of what we hold as our ideal culture and what's good in our culture. And so it really kind of hit me in this conversation where it's like, I imagine being at my dad's funeral ceremony a year later and being able to smile through it all. And what were they expecting? Like me to get up and sing a fucking song? But I could imagine then they could say, oh, I'm so proud of Andrea, how she's moved on from this or whatever. Whereas what were they going to say? Like, I'm so proud that Andrea is still mourning her dad, who she fucking adored. Whereas to me, I'm like, I should still be sad. And I cannot even remember when you offered me that book. It's Okay to Not Be Okay. I finally listened to it. There were just so many amazing things. I was going to save it for the end because that's been my resource this week. But there was a part where she said the first year is like a slog. You're in this fog of confusion and sadness and all these complicated things. But then the second year is almost harder because you realize your life does have to go on. Nothing stopped, nothing slowed down. The clock didn't rewind. Another year has passed. The world's moving and you got to move. And so, I think the reframing of, or really examining that juxtaposition with what we value around happiness and planning and everything going our way and with the slowness and the unpredictability of grief, like we have to be able to look at that critically.
Yes. I guess you start with that piece of being in a system and in a culture that just isn't going to meet you where you are. So you have to start by meeting yourself and taking a stand as much as you can. And so I don't know if you were feeling it, but where you were like, Andrea can't cry in a meeting, and knowing that you still needed to cry. And for some people it is, I mean, I know in Marissa Renee Lee's book, Grief is Love, she talks about especially as a woman of color, feeling like there was a lot of pressure about how do I show up and how do I be professional in this sort of way that a higher bar is set in her life. And she is like, you can't fall apart at a meeting.
Right.
You have to keep it together. You have, you know, that so much is on the line and it's not safe. And I think that that's a really big point. Like, as much as I might say, I wish we could all cry at board meetings, like, it's not safe. People start to worry about you
Yeah.
suddenly, like they're finding fault with you and you're getting fired. And so, how do we make space for
Hmm.
ourselves to feel our grief and to honor what we're feeling?
Right.
And also keep ourselves safe. And I have a mentor who's a poet, and she wrote a whole poem that I love, but in it, she says, "Your tears are holy water."
Mm.
And I just love that. Her name is Wendy Havlier Cherry. And she would always say that, like when we were working together, and I would be just like in the midst of crying
Mm.
and just letting it happen. And she would just say, "Your tears are holy water." And I would think to myself, like, well, then let's hurry up and find something to capture them.
Right.
Let's save them. And I've done that with my daughter. Like, there are
Mm.
times, I mean, it's never in a way that's trying to change where she is or belittle. It's
Mhm.
always, it feels like I wait for the appropriate moment and I say, "Do you want to capture some of your tears?" And she'll say,
Mm.
"Yeah." And so we'll have like a little bottle that we put them in, and occasionally we'll like water a plant with them, you know, and it's just
Oh.
this way of really respecting that and not trying to stop the process. And so, I mean, I think it's brilliant that you found your way to practices that supported you. I think it's important for people to know there is a way the second year is hard. And I've even worked with people in grief in the first year where there's kind of this interesting, almost like seesaw that you're on. I'm so sad I can't function. And then you're like, wait, I'm doing well. I think I'm okay. I think I'm metabolizing it. I think I'm good. And then it's like crash. But then you kind of expect, okay, we've been through all the major milestones. It's been a year. I know how to do this. I've seen myself go up. I've seen myself go down. I feel like I'm steady. And there's a different feeling of like, how do I want to do life? That you're asking bigger questions
Yeah.
about your life.
Yeah. I was thinking about what you said about the workplace and thinking about, that was a major part of me putting on the everything's okay facade. And definitely women of color, one of the only women of color at the level that I was at. And that would have been seen as shocking. I mean, they would have been terribly worried. But it does make me think about, and you and I have talked about this episode of Anderson Cooper's podcast, which is so good. And there's an episode that you and I both love with Stephen Colbert. And this is also mentioned in this other article. People used to wear black in mourning for a year. And so I'm like, I wonder if that was something that I could do that would bring awareness. I don't dress in black. So if you dressed in black, this would not make that much of a statement.
No one would know what was different for me because I'm constantly in black.
Right. But for me, who were like, very colorful, I like to change my colors with the seasons. Had I maybe put on a morning outfit, put morning on
Mm-hmm.
as my expression so that people knew, oh, yeah, I need to remember that underneath this, she is still
Mm-hmm.
moving through her grief. And not everybody would pick up on it, but I think some people would have. And that would have felt to me like a really appropriate step in the workplace. That would have empowered me to be
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm not totally compartmentalizing my grief. I'm not pretending for 8 to 10 hours a day that I'm not grieving. I'm wearing it.
Mm-hmm.
And some people will know that and some people won't. But like, this is my way of bringing my grief with me to work. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I wonder if that would have been a powerful way for me to do that.
I know. I mean, I think it could be.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think there are cultures that might wear even like an armband. So you'll know. And I think you're right. It sets a tone, it sets a context, it sets a way of reverence that, oh, I respect what you're walking through right now.
Hmm.
And I remember my ex husband, he was Cuban, and there was a lot that was still very alive culturally as his parents had come from Cuba in the 50s. So it was like so much was still alive for them. And my ex-husband, when he was really little, a baby. He was a baby when this happened, but he had like a skin eating bacteria or something that could kill you. And so he was in the hospital and the doctors were treating him. And there was a whole way spiritually that his dad was like, you make a promise to God, to the saint, of something like a sacrifice that you're going to make if so that someone else will be okay. And so he was going to wear white white for a year. And he wore white every day for a year, which is a really unusual thing to do. And that was his way of just making some sacrifice and putting
Mhm.
aside the part that's like, oh, I want to wear different clothes, or I want to get dressed, or maybe I'd be weird to wear
Sure.
white. It's like, no, I'm honoring that I want my son to survive this, and this is what I've chosen to do. I just really respected that level of commitment and of showing up in the world, to be in the
Mhm.
world. And like people might ask you, like, why do you always wear white?
Mm.
And as you were talking, I was thinking, and we get a couple of things right. So in our grief bereft culture, I
Yeah.
think it's important to see where are we doing things somewhat right that we could just do more of. And we could say, and
Mhm.
one of those things I was thinking is whenever people are following a hearse, everyone keeps their headlights on. And
Mm.
so whenever you're on the road and you see a bunch of headlights, it's like I instantly feel like, oh,
Yeah.
all these people are like mourning someone right now and they're together in this. And I just can feel like a sort of like, I want to get out of your way.
Yeah.
I want to let you, like that piece.
Mhm.
My dad was a police officer, which, not my favorite profession for anyone, not someone you love feeling like they're constantly in danger.
Yeah.
He didn't die in the line of duty, but the stress of his job at the time that he died, I think, did impact him,
Mhm.
impact his health, and is part of why he died. But
Mm.
police officers have a very ritualistic funeral. There was a whole thing where it was so much reverence. And I thought, wow, people must think somebody so fucking important
Mm.
just died. And not that my dad wasn't important to me, but it
You, yeah.
felt like a political figure. So it was like a bunch of flags, and like there were all these police in on motorcycles on the sides of the hearses. We're just like stopping all traffic, and I was like, "Holy shit, he must love this." If he's just
No.
looking down on this, just see just the level of respect and care that was
Mm.
part of saying goodbye. That he was part of a community, and that it matters a lot when they lose one of their own, and that they had a whole way that they held that. And while that wouldn't be my wish for my funeral, I was just like, wow, he didn't even need to make requests. Like this was just going to happen when he died. It was just going to be like this. And where I feel like I have to be really specific, like, please do cremate me. Please do like whatever, whatever feels real for you, but try to get everybody together and just say some things that you liked about me, and cry, please cry. Of course, cry.
Oh, I love that.
So you were sort of stopped from what would have happened naturally because of COVID. But did you feel like people got anything right, the ceremony or in the memorial service?
To be honest, no, because of all of the restrictions on COVID. I think because we're Catholic, I do think like the ceremonialness of we come together, we pray the rosary the day before the funeral. I'm going to get this all wrong, and any of my Catholic family is going to tell me what's right. But anyway, you pray the rosary. You view the body, open caskets is like a thing in Catholicism. And I
Mhm.
remember being a little kid and my great grandpa dying and seeing him, and and just remarking on like, oh, he looks so different. But it wasn't gross, it wasn't creepy. It was just like the last chance to see him and to see like for what it was, he did look peaceful. He was very old when he died. So I do think that the funeral director, he really tried. He really tried to allow for there to be as much ceremony and connection as possible given all of these restrictions. And there was a lot of protection happening. Most of the family saw my dad and his body in the funeral home the night before, and I didn't. And then my siblings called me and said, you need to go before the funeral because this is going to be really hard for you. And so the funeral director opened up for me, and I got to be with my dad by myself. And that was really, really special. And I took my guitar and I sang him his favorite songs, and it was amazing. And it was just me and him. But what I felt like I missed were those things for his whole community to be there for him. He was a pretty prominent figure in politics and in the nonprofit world, and it was so well known. And I just felt like so many people wanted to honor him and honor his life and support his family, and they just didn't get the chance to. And that made me so sad because I was like, he deserves that. He deserves all these people coming together to support one another and to remember him in like loving kindness. And he didn't get that. Like I'm sure people did on their own, but he didn't get that collective
Mhm.
coming together. And so, unfortunately, our funeral director tried his very best given the circumstances, and I will forever be grateful to him. And no,
Yeah.
we because of COVID, we didn't get to do those things
Yeah.
that I do think you're right. We do some things right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, I don't want to be buried, and like I don't want an open casket or whatever, but I can echo what you're saying. There's something about, because my dad, I mean, he's Episcopalian, it's like Catholic
Catholic
light.
light, I've heard.
And it was an open casket funeral, and I kind of thought, I don't need that, whatever. And then I went in and I saw him, and he actually looked so much like himself,
Mm.
which doesn't always
Right,
happen,
right.
that I thought he kind of had this sort of trickster, jokey personality. Like I kept thinking like he's going to sit up and laugh and
Mhm.
be like, I'm just kidding, and I was like, gosh, it's such a weird thing to relate to this body, that this is my dad, but he's like not here. But it's like, it's that thing, like the picture you're talking about, like taking a
Mhm.
picture of someone where it's, and I've seen you in your death. Like I've seen that your soul is not in your body anymore. I know I'm saying goodbye. And it was really hard because I either wrote a note or there was something, but I went to put it under his hand,
Mhm.
and then I could feel
Mhm.
that he wasn't there.
Yeah.
And that really was hard. And then, so he's in the casket, they close it, we go to the cemetery, they lower it in the ground. And I was like, wow, what an awful feeling to sort of watch that someone's about to be buried. And there's like parts of you that just really are like, but wait, what if,
Ugh.
do we check? Are we sure? Does he just like go into a coma that was really low heartbeat? And it was like so interesting, but I think that there was a finality to
Mhm.
it that really, it felt like I didn't know that to be something that I might have needed
Mhm.
until I actually had
Mm.
it. And then I think, okay, so how does that work? It'd be great to die in my house. It'd be great for people to be able to be with my body before it's cremated.
Mhm.
But I think it's important. And I kind of want to say, as we're talking about a grief bereft culture, that, I mean, how we die and what happens when, I think it's important to consider at some point in our lives. These are some wishes I have, and I try to do that with the adults in my life, just saying like, okay, do you want to be cremated? Do you want me to, is there any where special you would like your ashes to
Mhm.
be?
Mm.
Can I keep a little bit of
Yeah.
them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have my dad in a locket with his thumbprint, and I have his
Yeah.
ashes, and I wore it every day for 2 years. This last year, I finally would like take it off sometimes, but yeah, and I talk about my plans even before my dad passed,
Mm.
and my family was super uncomfortable with it. Even my husband is like, "Don't say that." Or like I have a DNR, do not resuscitate. And he's like, you're too young to have that. And I'm like, no, no, I'm not.
Mm-mm.
But what if this, but what if that, always this kind of, there has to be an exception. So it's interesting in talking about what you want when you die. And like, I think I have a will, I have it written down. My parents know, my siblings know, because there are things in there that they aren't going to agree with. And so I want them to be sure that it's not like made up or they're not fighting with one person. And so, I do talk about that, but I think I am thinking more about each moment that I'm with people. And I am thinking more about telling everybody more in my life that I love them, just
Mm.
expressing as much as I can now. So I
Mhm.
think that's kind of the balance. So I'm like, well, you might have to hear me make sure that you understand what I want when I die, but you're also going to hear me tell you that I love you with all my heart. Yeah, feels like an okay balance.
It's a good compromise. And a lot of people don't want to do that. And like, I
Yeah,
actually want to know from the people I love, what would
yeah.
you like? Have you made a will? And that's
Mhm.
another place that sort of aversion comes up. And it's like literally not going to kill you to make a will. But it really is that people feel that
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm bringing it here. I mean, I can promise you, you can make a birth plan and you 100% are not
Right.
going to get to follow that birth plan. A birth plan didn't make the birth go great, and a death plan isn't going to make you die
Right.
soon or in any particular way. And that there's something that's sort of a gift,
Yeah.
to the people that you're leaving behind, because I think in that moment of loss, it's so overwhelming and having to make decisions. There's so many decisions to make. It's really a gift, as many of those decisions
Yeah.
you can take off the plate of someone and just let them have grief.
Yeah.
So we're at an hour.
I know. I'm looking at the time. We are trying to keep them to an hour, but I think there are other things that came up. Like I would, like to continue our conversation about medicating
Hmm.
the sort of most impacted or, person who's grieving and talking about where we are comfortable with death and where we aren't. And I love your idea of talking about more ideas about where we're getting it right. So I think there'll be a part 2, 3, 4, who knows, of this, but this was a wonderful conversation. And I'll just ask you, how are you kind of getting in touch with your heart and your grief this week?
Yeah, so I I've been posting more on social media and just holding true to my desire to have a place for people to keep feeling seen and heard in their grief. And I was looking through some grief things I had saved, and there was a picture of Joan Didion. And I remembered reading the book, The Year of Magical Thinking. When my dad died, a friend had sent it to me, and she talks about when her husband died. He died suddenly of a heart attack. But her first chapter starts with this quote, and it just brought me back so fast to that week, like right after my dad died. She writes, "Life changes fast. Life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner and life as you know it ends." And they actually were just eating dinner, and he had a heart attack and fell over at dinner. And she says a little later, she says it again, life changes in an instant, the ordinary instant. And I think it just put me back in touch with how ordinary the moment was before I heard the words, Dad died. And you and I have talked about that. We were both in these sort of mundane fights. You don't even know what the fight was anymore. And it just like life changed. It wasn't like, oh, this thing happened and then we got back to it. It was like life changed forever in that moment.
Yeah.
And so that put me really in touch with my grief this week.
Oh, that's beautiful. I mentioned mine earlier. I finally I listened to the audiobook of it. The author reads it, Megan Devine. It's okay that you're not okay. And I think parts that really resonated, 3 years on into grieving my dad, was I felt so normal in ways that I think I had felt. I don't know if I personally felt abnormal, but I felt like other people thought I was abnormal. But it felt so true to what I should be doing. I'm like, I should be crying right now. I should be talking about him right now. I should be wearing his fingerprint with his ashes around my neck. I should be quitting my job. I should be to spend time with my kids. I should be picking up this crazy new hobby. Like things that felt so absurd, that I was like, they felt so right to me, but I could see in people's eyes and reactions like it was absurd. I felt so normal. And I was just like, oh, I am doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And I don't know, it resonated in my heart. And if there is anyone who is in acute grief, looking back, I wish I would have picked it up when you first sent it, because I think there would have been a lot of things in that first year that it really would have supported me navigating all of that a little bit more. So if there is anybody in kind of any part of their acute stage, I would recommend it. I did find listening to it was easier because she does have a very soothing voice. But if you're anywhere in your grief process, or if you know someone or are working with someone with grief, I think it provides a light, it just shines on it. I think one of the most profound things that she said when she started, she's also a therapist, and she said, she worked with clients who were experiencing grief before. And then she also had an after. Her husband died very suddenly when he was 40. And she was like, I wish I could go back. I did everything wrong. And so even if you haven't experienced that life before, life after kind of grief, I would read this book, because I think it at least lays out for you that shakeup is so real and needs to be so much more space for it. That's what supported me.
I love that.
And I thank you for it.
Thank you for naming that you wish you would have read it in acute grief. I always have this question mark about if we even have the capacity to take in any information in acute grief. So I usually don't recommend it in acute grief. I usually tell people to give it to their partner or whoever's trying to support them, so that they understand what they're holding for you, that I think it's really important. But yeah, I'd be curious if anyone did read it in their acute grief, or if you can, and what it offers. But I will say, isn't it amazing how seen you can feel just by reading the words of someone you don't even know?
Totally.
It's one of the most beautiful books, I think, to just feel the levels of validation that she offers. It's so well done. And it's a really needed book. It's unique and it's one of a kind. We'll always have some resources. And so because we talk about so much, and so that we'll include the book titles and authors that we've shared on the episode, and where to find those things. And next week, our third episode, we have marked as acute grief. So that's the terrain we're entering.
All right. So we'll be talking about that. All right.
All right, Andrea. Good to talk to you today.
Love you.
Love you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of All the Grief. You can find us on Instagram at All the Grief Pod, And please take a moment to rate our podcast and share us with your friends. We'd love to keep expanding our reach to all the people who could benefit from conversations on grief. Take care.